This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. US President Donald Trump has often said that tariffs is his favorite word. And within weeks of taking office, he imposed 25% tariffs on all imports from America's two biggest trading partners, Mexico and Canada, and 10% tariffs on goods from China. Subsequently, he paused the tariffs for 30 days after Mexico and Canada promised to take certain measures to curb illegal migration and cross border fentanyl smuggling. Given his repeated statements that he is looking at tariffs as a source of revenue, it seems like he is looking at them more as a permanent feature rather than as a temporary negotiating tool, as some analysts are assuming. He has also used aggressive rhetoric about imposing 100% tariffs on BRIC plus countries if they try to create an alternative to the dollar. So, how do we understand these moves from the Trump administration? Is the US moving away from a half century old paradigm of open trade and integrated markets and into one of local production and protected markets? How should the global south respond to these measures given the disparity in economic power? Or is all this just about creating chaos, which Trump knows how to do? We discuss the economics of Trump's tariff diplomacy in this episode of In Focus. And we have with us the economist C.P. Chandrasekhar, Senior Research Fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute, University of Massachusetts Amherst, the US. Chandru, welcome to In Focus. Thank you so much for taking time for this.
Thank you for having me again.
So, Chandru, to start with, I was wondering if you can give us a quick overview of how tariffs have traditionally been used by countries. Was it mainly to protect domestic industry, for instance, and whether Trump is moving beyond that to also use it as a revenue stream come geopolitical weapon? Is this a new paradigm we're looking at?
Well, what are the purposes for which tariffs have been used in the past? There's, of course, the original sort of attempt to identify tariffs as a means by which the protection which tariffs offers in terms of rendering imports more expensive, as a means of trying to foster and promote what would be nascent industries that in the early stages of industrialization, you need to actually resort to these kinds of tariffs, it was argued. And this was true of having some form of protection, was true not just of countries in more recent years, and particularly after the Second World War, when a number of newly independent countries post decolonization decided to use tariffs as a mechanism of protecting their domestic market in order to promote industrial growth. I mean, it was something which was actually adopted by today's advanced nations, if you want to call them, or today's developed industrial nations, as means to actually ensure that they, while getting access to global markets, either through colonial subordination or other forms of subordination, try to protect their own domestic markets in order to be able to push their domestic industry. So that's one idea. This whole idea of that you try to build your industrial base, particularly the early stages of industrialization. But as I said, subsequently, particularly as a result of the sort of evolution of the international division of labor, in which the developed industrial countries became principally producers of manufactured goods, and the underdeveloped countries or the less developed countries of the world were principally producers of agricultural commodities and primary goods of various kinds. That at the point of time when these countries decided, particularly after the Second World War, but in fact even earlier, the first part of the 20th century, that when they decided that they needed to actually, in order to be able to increase per capita income or register a reasonably high rate of growth of aggregate income relative to the rate of growth of population, that they decided that what needs to be done is they have to diversify away from agriculture, because there were limits to productivity increases which technology had set as far as agriculture or primary production was concerned. Whereas on the other hand, there were much more opportunities which the trajectory of technology had ensured of productivity increase if you moved into manufacturing. And therefore, they decided that it's necessary to move into manufacturing. And they saw it as being also quite important because of the fact that the movements in international trade were such that actually primary commodities, agricultural commodities, and primary goods of other kinds like raw materials, etc., where we're at the losing end of both the shifts in global demand as well as the sort of relative prices or the terms of trade between manufacturers and primary goods. So if you really wanted to garner some benefits from trade which were significant enough and not have balance of payments difficulties, they thought that it's necessary to foster manufacturing and use protection as a device for that. But the last thing I'd like to say is that, independent of Trump's claim that he's imposing these tariffs essentially, principally as a means of mobilizing revenues, that is actually a very uncertain prospect because it depends upon what tariff does in terms of domestic demand for importables. Because if you don't import, then which essentially means that those tariffs actually don't get placed on these imports because they have to cross your border for the tariff to actually be operative. So if the sort of responsiveness of domestic demand for imported goods it results in a decline in demand for imported goods and therefore decline in imports, it's unclear how an increase in tariffs would necessarily generate increases in revenues. So I think that's more of an excuse. It's basically that.
Isn't he perhaps looking at a scenario where by selectively imposing these tariffs on certain countries' imports, maybe some other countries are going to be sort of importing those goods, and they will then be ready to pay those tariffs or something like that. Is that what he's looking at? You think?
No, so the point is, the US government would get revenues from the tariffs it imposes if it so happens that after the imposition of the tariffs, imports do not decline or the demand for imported goods do not decline by as much as to neutralize the benefit of higher revenues for every unit of that imports, if the aggregate volume of imports of those commodities come down.
Right. So you're saying that because of these tariffs, there might also be a case of import substitution happening where the consumer demand
Exactly,
might go for domestic goods which
yeah,
are
exactly,
cheaper.
and that's what I wanted to say. That if you look at it, he had decided to use this as a means of saying that as part of his making America great again, or whatever he perceives it to be, his strategy to be, that he wanted to bring back manufacturing to the United States, and he was actually appealing to the working class, in particular the white working class, which actually felt dispossessed by liberalization because of the fact that there was a shift of manufacturing capacity out of the United States, which actually creates a complication. It creates a complication because while this might be, if it does so happen that American manufacturing gets a boost because of tariffs, which is likely, then you're in essence saying that this is not something which may be good for American capital, for American industrialists who actually find benefit in searching out the lowest cost locations across the world, given the large amounts of low wage, the large low wage reserve army which is available in countries abroad. They've been trying to relocate capacities in order to reduce costs of production and therefore remain competitive vis-a-vis international producers. So they're going to lose that benefit partly because of the fact that if they now produce abroad and bring it into America, the price would be higher because of the fact that there is tariff, and therefore they might decide that they need to jump those tariff barriers and bring production back. But that would also mean that prices would rise in the domestic market.
Yeah, so this is very interesting, Chandru, for what you're saying, because if it's going to be not very cost effective for American manufacturers, then if Trump, who's basically a flag bearer of certain kinds of American capital, if he's still going through with this, does it indicate perhaps a shift in the balance of power away from the American manufacturing lobby towards the tech lobby, perhaps, represented by people like Elon Musk, who don't really care if this happens because, they are not so much dependent on having goods produced in the US and paying labor and so on, because a lot of it is happening, it's a cloud capital kind of a thing. Is that something you would sort of
Well,
agree with?
yeah, but it could all, see, it could partly be that, but you must realize that, I mean, a dominant component of American capital is finance. And finance has multiple interests. It's not only has got interests in the tech area and in the new rising AI and the chips associated with AI and so on. It also has interests in the old manufacturing businesses in areas like automobiles and so on. And they wouldn't like a situation where, because domestic prices go up as a result of the tariffs, even if domestic production goes up, that might have an adverse impact on demand. It depends upon, if your employment increases and demand increases, irrespective of the increases in domestic prices of commodities, that's net positive. But if, on the other hand, the increases in prices in the domestic commodities restrains domestic demand, despite some increase in employment that you might get, because we are unsure about how much of an increase in employment this would be, because many of these areas are pretty capital intensive in nature, and therefore, even if manufacturing production comes back, we don't know how much is going to be the increase, because also, you can have retaliatory taxes imposed by other countries, and they've been threatening to do that before, of course, the pause in the tariffs that you mentioned. And of course, China has already announced some retaliatory tariffs. And if there are retaliatory tariffs, you might lose out in terms of exports. And therefore, there might be a loss in employment in the export oriented sectors within America, to the extent that there is. And on the other hand, you may not have too much of an increase in employment because of the capital intensiveness of the manufacturing that you bring back. So we don't know. These are all uncertain, outcomes. But I think he decided to make bringing manufacturing back as a slogan by which he could actually, you know, win back, and or not win back, but retain and expand his working class base, in particular his white working class base. And so it might be that, in doing so, by this means, if he actually implements them in full, which is likely given the way he's talking, then he would give other concessions. It's not that he would say that, oh, I'm going to go completely with tech. I mean, he might give other concessions. He might actually say that, I'm going to reduce any sort of anti-monopoly or anti-oligopoly sort of restrictions, which America has imposed in the past as part of antitrust legislation. I'm going to relax that. I'm going to reduce regulation. I'm going to allow you to diversify into certain new areas of, including finance, by making things easier. I mean, he might actually try all of that, but it's all very complex, and it's all very messy.
Right. So, CP, one of the things he has said, of course, I mean, you pointed out this contradiction, right, between trying to get revenue, additional revenue from tariffs on the one hand, and then getting using these tariffs as a prod to shift manufacturing back into the US. If manufacturing is going to come back to the US, and you're going to, do some kind of import substitution, with domestic manufacturers' goods getting purchased by consumers and so on, then you won't get your tariff revenue. Now, alongside this, there is also another dimension which the U.S. Secretary, the former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers has described as a self-inflicted supply shock that could cause inflation. Now, this inflationary aspect of this whole tariff scenario, Trump has responded to that by saying that he will give tax cuts, which will put more money in the hands of consumers, and therefore they won't really be affected by inflation so much. So, what is your understanding of this dynamic? Will they hurt U.S. citizens regardless of whatever he does?
Yeah, you see, also, okay, let's first let's I mean, I don't know what exactly Summers meant by the self-inflicted supply shock in particular, but there are two aspects to this. First, of course, as has been pointed out by a number of people, you see, over a period of time, including as a result of the substitute for NAFTA, the trade agreement, which was instituted under Trump in his previous tenure, that there is a high degree of integration, and therefore, the supply chains are very integrated between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Okay, so each commodity, let us say, as I think it was, the Financial Times or something, which pointed out that you can have a commodity which crosses borders in its different stages of manufacture. So you might have some components which are produced in the United States, which then go to Canada or go to Mexico, then get assembled into something else and come back. And then there could be some changes which occur in the United States, and then that goes again to maybe to Mexico, and then finally the fully produced car comes back into America. So if the supply chain is such because of the way in which trade has evolved over time and this whole, this emergence of these global value chains, then you're saying that if commodities are constantly crossing borders, each time there's going to be a tariff which is imposed, isn't it? Because you're saying it's an across the board tariff of whatever be 20% or whatever it may be. So we don't even know the extent of the increase in prices because you like can actually have a situation where there would be cascading tariffs on tariffs. There's one commodity which comes in and there's a tariff imposed on it. Then you use it to produce something else which then goes abroad and then comes back again in some other form. So there would be a tariff imposed on a commodity which already includes within its price a previous tariff which has been imposed at a certain earlier stage of the value chain. So we don't even know what's going to be the impact in terms of the extent of the price increase which could occur in a context where it is two countries which are deeply integrated with the United States as part of the United States' own strategy of molding a special relationship between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Okay, so if that's the case, now then to say that I'll give you tax cuts, and tax cuts means you'll have more money in your hands, and therefore even if prices go up, then it's not going to really make a difference for you in terms of your real purchasing power because prices go up, but your money income goes up because of the tax cuts, or money earnings go up because of the tax cuts, and therefore we're not going to see any change. I mean, this is all very speculative. This is not based on any sort of serious study or understanding of how it works. And those studies itself would be extremely difficult to undertake and arrive at definitive results, because that's the nature of these sort of complex inter-industry or intra-industry linkages which we have. So I don't know. But we definitely know that prices are going to go up. Okay. And how much they'll go up and how much of a tax cut is needed for the money incomes to be adequate enough to keep purchasing power constant, all of that is completely up in the air.
Right. So there is a good chance that U.S. consumers could be hurt by this kind of a tariff war that you started. There is also a good chance, as you sort of explained just now, that American businesses could get hurt as well, given how integrated the supply chain is, across manufacturing sectors. Now, if we look at this, the entire
And
thing.
the possible retaliatory tariffs.
Yes, retaliatory tariffs too. Now, if we look at this from a slightly different vantage point, now, do you think no, there are certain analysts, political analysts, who sort of take this only sort of semi-seriously? They dismiss it as Trump's eccentric leadership. He's an agent of chaos, is what they call him, and then say he's evil to sow chaos. And then after like 2 weeks, nothing is going to happen. Like he declared all these tariffs with a lot of fanfare, and then 1 week later he paused them. So this kind of thing is going to keep happening, is how they view it. But I was just wondering, do you see any kind of a change in the sort of structure of the world economy and capital flows, which suggests that perhaps tariffs are here to stay and globalization might be giving way to localization? Because he has said all these things about tariffs before he got elected, and he still got a lot of funding from various powerful donors who have stakes in how the economy, U.S. economy, is reshaped with or without tariffs. So, do you see any larger trends in terms of a movement towards localization, given the Ukraine war and so many other things which are happening?
So, well, let's look at it this way. Firstly, this turn to protectionism in the US actually had begun to occur even earlier. I mean, in sense, even Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, as the Europeans pointed out and many others pointed out, was something which was going to affect, was actually trying to boost the competitiveness through subsidies and other means, competitiveness of US production in strategic areas or considered strategic areas, and at the expense of imports from abroad. So, so a sort of protectionist turn, it was there in some sense even earlier. The whole idea that America has lost out too much of its production capacity as part of processes of relocation, and that is in fact challenging its position as a hegemon otherwise.
Is it factually correct? Is it factually true that has America lost out on has its production capacity declined overall, if you look at
Of
across
course,
the board?
because it's been running for years now. Trade deficits. See, American capital hasn't lost out really, but American economy has lost out because of relocation. Okay, so what you are basically trying to do, there've been, in fact, there've been special tax laws which basically wanted them at least to bring their profits back, and if they bring their profits back, you try to give them some concession so that it comes and undertake some activity within the United States, whereas they were in fact trying to keep even their profits abroad because they wanted to avoid taxation in the US, or didn't see it as a location to actually bring back this surplus. I do think that was there, but there is the other thing that it's not. One is that there was that tendency towards, if you want to call it, sort of partial deglobalization, which had begun, and which was part of the understanding of the United States on what it needs to do, or the United States, government and the deep state and so on, especially given the perceived threat which China is seen as posing to them, exaggerated or otherwise. Now, the other thing is that, so if that was happening, and then the question is, okay, it's not that this is new. So we are talking about a trend which seems to be long term. But is what Trump saying merely showmanship, that actually is not going to implement all this? The problem with that is that there are two things: the extent of what he has promised, not merely during the campaign, but before actually taking office, and the degree to which he's sort of made announcements and issued executive orders, etc. Not merely with respect to tariffs and so on, but with respect to a whole range of other things, means that, he is in fact pushing himself to a point where, if he doesn't go at least part of the way in doing what he's threatening to do, then he would lose legitimacy. I mean, it would be, like the boy crying wolf. You keep saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and then you step back, then nobody will believe you. This is just virtually the beginning of his term. So if he's being so aggressive and vocal on things varying from what he's going to do with the Gaza Strip, of course, to protectionism, then even if it doesn't do it, go at least part of the way, I mean, he'll lose legitimacy. So I think he himself is sort of maybe possibly putting himself into this trap. And even if he wants to then withdraw because suddenly good sense comes to prevail and so on, it might be difficult. So I do think that there is a shift. I mean, I think there's still a section of the American elite which is delusional, which actually thinks, haha, he'll come and say all these things, but he's not going to do all of it, and not only in this area, in a whole host of areas where he's threatening to go, completely overturn what has been long held views, or long prevailing traditions in the United States. And this idea that, no, all this cannot happen to, it can't happen to us, and I think that's partly delusional. Something is going to happen. So we are talking about a new era in some sense.
Right. So you are not convinced of this line of thinking that this is all showmanship, and is trying to sort of be this agent of chaos, and somebody who thrives in chaos kind of a situation. Now, moving slightly to an aspect which is closer home, Chandru. Trump has said many times that if we lose the dollar as the world currency, I think that would be the equivalent of losing a war. I mean, those are his words. And he has threatened 100% tariffs on all the BRICS, now BRICS plus countries, if they dare to explore an alternative to the dollar. No, I haven't seen any evidence that the BRICS countries are any closer to coming up with an alternative compared to say 30 years ago. But do you think this de-dollarization, or having an alternative to the dollar being the world's reserve currency, where do we stand really on this, number one? And number two, do you think this Trump's, if you may put it this way, a rather crude projection of America's economic supremacy or dominance, do you think this is going to accelerate this search for an alternative to the US dollar? And if the search were to accelerate, do you think there will be progress on that front?
Well, let's say there are two ways of looking at this. One is, of course, we can ask the question: is there at the moment any challenge to the dollar as the world's principal reserve currency? Okay. And I don't think there is. I don't think there is. And because not merely are so many, such a large proportion of global trade denominated in dollars, it also is that we must recognize that the world's wealth holders, not just American wealth holders, but the world's wealth holders, see in the dollar a safe currency in which to hold their wealth, or dollar denominated assets as being safer assets in which to hold their wealth. And if there is a turn towards protectionism, you actually would possibly see the dollar strengthening. Because it would appear that, America is now trying to resolve the fact that it has a significant trade deficit with most countries in the world. And then, therefore, if that gets partly resolved, it should actually strengthen the dollar. And if there is some boost to the American economy because of that protectionism, that would also strengthen the dollar. So, looked at in that sense, I don't see at the moment a challenge to the dollar as the world's principal reserve currency, because, as I said, besides the fact of transactions being predominantly denominated in the dollar, the world's wealth holders still are willing to place their bets on the dollar and in dollar denominated financial assets. However, one issue is because of America's, and not just under Trump, but even earlier than this government just in place just now, it's is this idea of trying to impose sanctions which cuts countries off, like you cut Russia off, or you cut you try to cut countries off, you try to cut China off, in some sense, from the world's payment system. So you say that you can't have financial firms having transactions in which these countries are able to convert their currencies into dollars, or can actually accept dollar payments through SWIFT or whatever it may be. Now, if you do that, and countries have trade interests, like India has trade interests with Russia, it gets a lot of benefit in terms of its trade with Russia, then they would be forced to seek out alternative ways of trying to have payments and settlements in the trade between, let's say, Russia and India, or Russia and many other countries, or a China and many other countries. And if that happens, you're basically saying that the aggressiveness of the US in using the fact that the dollar dominates the world's payment system, because it's the world's principal reserve currency, using that aggressive posture, in some sense, opens up space for trade and other kinds of flows, capital flows and financial flows, which are not in terms of the dollar, and therefore, in some sense, reduces, I mean, reduces the expanse over which the dollar dominates, because of actually actions on the part of the United States itself. So that is happening, I think, but that doesn't challenge the dominance of the dollar as the world's reserve currency
Right.
even
So
today.
whatever challenge might be sort of in incipient form, which might emerge, it comes as a response to the geopolitical aspect, the political moves in terms of sanctions and so on, rather than something from the
Yeah,
economic domain
quite
itself.
crucially. Yeah, quite crucially. Yeah. And of course, it also comes partly because of a large amount of trade between China and the rest of the world, which results in a situation where, people might be willing to consider a certain degree of settlement, bilateral settlement vis-a-vis their currency and the RMB, or the Chinese yuan.
Right, but the Chinese elite also hold their assets in dollars, right? I mean, isn't that the
Yes,
case?
yes. Well, I mean, yeah. Some, I suppose, some, well, some openly because the system allows it, and we don't know. I mean, like all elites, maybe some which is not so open, but yeah, I'm sure.
Right. So how this new tariff war that we've been talking about, since Trump got took over in his office, how do you see this affecting the global South in general? Because there is clearly a disparity between many countries in the global South who have a big chunk of their exports going to the US or American allies, and so there is clearly the power balance is in the favor of the US. So what is their strategic toolkit in terms of managing these kinds of tariffs? Because if they impose retaliatory tariffs, it might affect them. It may not affect the US that much as the American tariffs might affect these global South countries.
Yeah, I suppose let's face it. I mean, for these countries, earning foreign exchange is quite crucial because, as we said, I mean, structurally, they are in a subordinate position within an unequal world order. And every dollar they earn is crucial because if they run trade and current account deficits, as most of them do, then you are you're dependent on capital flows from abroad, and that can either create difficulties, like countries which are in the middle of debt distress or even debt default are experiencing. And it also increases your dependence. Because of the kind of capital flows you're dependent upon, and therefore you're subject to influence by stronger powers. So for them, foreign, earning hard currency is quite crucial, and exports to America was a significant source of hard currency for many of these countries, because America is a large market, and as I said, Americans have, the American economy has increasingly relied on imports in order to meet its consumption and even investment needs. So therefore, if there is protectionism of this kind, obviously it shrinks the degree to which you can earn dollars from one of your principal markets, earn hard currency, let us say, from one of your principal markets. And therefore, it would be damaging for the South, without doubt, yes.
Right. We're running out of time, Chandru. One last question before we wrap up. A quick question. Now, India is, of course, one of the key members of BRICS, and Trump has been going on about BRICS being a source of some kind of threat to the supremacy of the US dollar and so on. Suppose Russia and China are also part of BRICS, and we know what kind of tensions exist between these two and the US. Suppose there were to be a situation where Russia and China and maybe the others also decide to sort of explore a BRICS fronted alternative currency, and the US is threatening the BRICS countries with sanctions. How do you think India should respond? Should we sort of risk it and explore it, or should we sort of back down and risk breaking up the BRICS kind of integrated alliance?
I at the moment, despite it's true there has been some talk of that kind, I don't think there is any real prospect at the moment of the BRICS being able to generate either a single one of their currencies or some kind of a joint new means of exchange, and possibly a store of value, which is different from hard currencies, and in particular the
Do
dollar.
you
I
think it's
don't see.
more likely that if there is a challenge which comes, it'll be like these countries trading in their own currencies rather than coming
Yeah,
up
I
with an
mean, there's
alternative
a
currency?
possibility of bilateral or even sort of slightly plurilateral arrangements among these countries as part of trade, because of the difficulty of being able to trade with each other, particularly vis-a-vis Russia and China, as a result of the kind of restrictions with the US and Europe either already imposing or threatening to impose on trade by those countries vis-a-vis the rest of the world, that is not vis-a-vis them. So they might actually see the need for some kind of bilateral payments and settlement system. And but the point is, if in any case you're shrinking the space these countries have in your market by becoming protectionist, then you're already pushing them to seek new trade avenues elsewhere in the world. So there's you can put out these threats and all, but I don't think countries are going to completely drop it. There might be an odd country here or there, but definitely all of those who, I mean, the original BRICS members and those who've been joining in recent BRICS summits, I don't think all of them are going to say that, oh, we'll drop all of this, and because we're threatened by what the United States is saying. And then finally, the United States does need them also as strategic partners. I mean, vis-a-vis China and Russia as well. So it's not going to be all that easy.
Right. Thank you so much, Chandu. That's all I have for you in this episode of In Focus. It was really great listening to you, illuminating as always. And we could go on talking about this in further detail, but we have run out of time. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having
me. In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.